Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on the issues. You're listening to Out Front with Mike Shelby.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Out Front, the show where we talk about intelligence, security, creating a first world zone in a third world country, and how to win at low intensity conflict, or at least not lose. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. On today's show, I'm talking about the 3 Things Challenge. What 3 things would you want going into a gray zone scenario? I'll issue a challenge, and also I'll share my 3 things with you. First, I have a couple of notes we got to get through. Number one, I see people asking me about, have I addressed the Patriot Front arrests on Saturday in Idaho? I have. That went out in this morning's early morning. And I also did a supplemental brief mid-morning today. That's over on the Forward Observer High side, which, by the way, you can get access to. Oh, and yeah, we're about to make some major changes over at Forward Observer. Number one, we're getting a new website very soon. But number two, Forward Observer Early Warning is about to become about 90% domestic. So we're going to completely flip. The geopolitical stuff, the strategic stuff is not going away. War with Russia and China, for instance, not going away, just being moved somewhere else. And I'll have more on that later in the week. And by the way, you can get access to that at forwardobserver.com/subscribe. All right. With that, I have to now move on and thank my Patreon supporters. If you want to support the show, head over to patreon.com/outtfront. Kick me a few bucks a month or whatever the show is worth to you. A big shout out of the day goes to Jesse, Coffee and Gunpowder, Armed Sailor, and Drew and Hickok, both coming in big at $10 a month. Thank you to everyone. We're at 98 supporters. When we hit 100 supporters, I will do a drawing, a randomized drawing, and give you, if you are picked, your choice of an area intelligence course account, a Gray Zone Book Club account, or a Forward Observer Early Warning account. And I'm just going to turn that into a monthly thing, a monthly drawing for Patreon supporters. So, again, that's patreon.com/outtfront. And I'll tell you what, whenever we hit 100, if that's today or tomorrow or next week or next month, I'll go ahead and do the drawing and announce it on the show. All right. Now I want to turn to something a little closer to home, and that is what's going on with the beef industry right now. I cannot speak for the entire country, but here in Central Texas, things are looking rather bleak. And I know people have been ringing this bell and sounding this alarm for a while, including us over at Forward Observer. And it is gotten progressively worse this year. The average person has no idea how bad the beef industry is getting or is going to get in the years to come. And this thing's not over in 6 months. This thing's, if we're lucky, it might be over in 2 to 3 years. The biggest problem for us right now is drought. When most people in Texas do not run, most people growing hay in Texas are not running irrigation. And so when you have no rain, you have no hay. Out at our place, we have had 1 cutting in March and not a single cutting since then. And typically we have at least 2 in 3 or more in a good year. Grass is as low as it was in February or January. So if you're not running irrigation, you're not growing hay. And that's a lot of people in Texas. And if there's no rain, there's no hay. If there's no hay, cattle populations come down, because what happens is ranchers will sell off their feeder calves because they can't afford to feed them. And what happens is cattle populations start to shrink. And then when everything eventually gets worked out, you have much smaller cattle populations, and that is when you get beef shortages. And beef shortages might work work themselves out in a year or two. The problem is when there's very high demand and ranchers can afford to feed their cattle again. They don't want to sell off producing cattle. They don't want to sell off cattle that are going to. That's why they typically just sell the steers, but they don't want to sell off the females because in another year that female is going to be producing. That heifer is going to be producing another calf to grow the herd. So I think there's a very good chance we do see beef shortages, and maybe we get lucky and we get rain for the entire month of July, and it's just we get 2 hours of rain a day and we get 7 cuttings. Unless that happens, I do think we're going to see beef shortages later this year and into next year. Again, maybe it's different in different parts of the country, but here in Central Texas, it's looking pretty bad. Kind of on that, someone said, I just poached deer when beef is too expensive. I'm sure a lot of people will be doing that. The problem is, in a lot of places, deer are way too numerous, very large deer populations, much higher than they should be. The problem is, that whole thing, like Great Depression, I'm just going to go out and shoot a deer. Wild game populations are going to get whittled down pretty darn fast. And here's the thing, this Pacific decadal oscillation, I've been talking about this for several years, probably all the way back to at least 2017, the first time I heard of it. The Pacific decadal oscillation has been oscillating at like 3 to 4 year intervals, which means this is probably not like a 6-month drought. This is probably like a 3 to 4 month drought. And if you're especially in California, there's actually a chance that it becomes a decadal drought. Like the PDO if you go back more than 50 years ago, the PDO runs in about, 20 to 40 / let's just call it 30-year cycles, 20 to 30-year cycles. And so there's actually a chance if we go back to the 20 or 30-year cycles, then we could have decades of drought. All right. At any rate, something to keep an eye on. And listen, if now is actually a really good time to be a consumer, a customer of beef. I would not be buying. I went to the grocery store the other day and looked at beef prices, and they're absolutely incredible. In a lot of places, you're going to have ranchers who are willing to sell off in 1s and 2s, or maybe small handfuls of these feeder calves, or or even calves that are of butchering size, and it'll be a lot cheaper if you can butcher it yourself or have it even taken to a processor. It'll be a lot cheaper than it will be buying it from the grocery store. So now is actually probably a really good time to get into the direct to consumer business if you know local ranchers, which, by the way, is a super important part of preparedness. Linking up, building relationships with local ranches and small farms and homesteaders. Community supported agriculture has been a growing business, a growing kind of niche industry. I don't see why community supported agriculture as an industry, there's probably zero reason why it shouldn't be competing with the local grocery stores, the local chain grocery stores in most instances. That I think really that is the future of it should be the future of eating for a great many Americans. All right. A friend of mine, moving on here. Well, before I get to a friend of mine, I put a bunch of more plants in the ground this weekend because I am greatly concerned, not so much this year, but next year, with 2 successive years of decreasing fertilizer usage. I'm concerned about what's going to happen to food prices into next year and beyond. And so we're just trying to produce more, and we'll be canning more. And I think that's something that everyone really ought to be doing. And it's gotten to the point now where I'm reading my weekly circulars in the newspaper, looking at those, 99 cents a pound, whatever deals they have going on. And if it's cannable, I'll probably just go buy a cannable. If it can be put into a can, I'll probably just go buy a lot of it and can some of that stuff as well and just put it away. My hands were dirty after I got done putting these plants in the ground, and I went and turned the hose on and washed my hands off. And as I was doing that, I just thought, man, how blessed we are in this country to have clean water available on demand and virtually limitless insofar as much as you're going to consume. And it's cheap as well. We're absolutely blessed. We owe it to the people who built our society and build our infrastructure to save it, to save our society and save our infrastructure. Part of saving our society sometimes means destroying the things that are destroying our society. And by that, I mean fake meat. Have you seen the ingredients list on these fake meat packages? Here, I'll just run these off for you. Water, pea protein, expeller pressed canola oil. By the way, if you never want to eat canola oil again, just get on YouTube and search for some videos that are called How Canola Oil is Made. Rice protein, dried yeast, cocoa butter, methyl cellulose, potato starch, salt, potassium chloride, beet powder color, apple extract, pomegranate concentrate, sunflower lecithin, so on and so forth. Pyridoxine hydrochloride. I don't know. I guess that's vitamin B6. They inject a bunch of vitamins in there because anything they're putting in there is vitaminless. But at least there's no soy or gluten in there. So a friend of mine posted something on Twitter. And by the way, actually, I'm surprised that's not as bad as some I've seen. And I think I pulled that off of either Beyond Meat or the Impossible Burger or whatever. But a friend of mine posted something on Twitter. You should go check him out. His handle is @RatUtopian. He posted about a gray zone tactic to fight back against fake meat. And I'm not condoning this. By the way, I just thought it was interesting. Interesting what he posted. He says Impossible / Beyond Meat are what we call a loss leader. He's talking about in grocery stores. And he says a loss leader is, quote, a product that is being sold at a loss in order to either get you in the door or to expand market share to eventually profit. In most cases, he says, in places where you see these products, the store itself is not paying to have them in their inventory. In reality, the capital invested in these meat substitutes, particularly Impossible and Beyond, is paying them. They're paying the grocery store to take up shelf space, and they're providing the product at no cost. Most places, he says, won't turn this down if offered. I mean, it's free stuff. You get paid for it regardless if it sells. And if it does sell, you profit from that as well. Not a bad deal for Kroger, etc. That opens us up for some fun. And by us, he means them. That opens them up for some fun, however, as this stuff is perishable. And he goes on to say that you could can accidentally pick up a few Impossible meat packs. And then as you cruise around the grocery store, as you cut around the edges of the grocery store, maybe halfway to the register, you decide you really don't want to buy this Impossible burger anyway. And maybe you just leave it on a shelf somewhere like everyone else does with stuff that they pick up in a moment of heated passion and decide they don't want later. And he goes on, and by the way, this is what he says, not what I say. He says, in essence, if enough people do this, then the grocery stores are going to have to start throwing that out. They're not going to put room temperature Impossible burgers back in the cooler, or they shouldn't at least. And they may also call the company rep later and ask for more because they're getting the stuff for free after all. And he says that may cause the companies to ramp up production on a loss leader. So if you're producing a loss leader and you ramp up production, you're losing more money. And he says, ultimately basically driving companies into insolvency. Okay. That's a bit of a leap there. And that's not a quote. Go back and read what he wrote. Pretty interesting, interesting theory there. And also an interesting tactic as well. Really gets you it cuts to the heart of the gray zone matter because, in the gray zone, like it's probably not ethical. It's also not illegal. And I guess ethics are depending on your point of view. Maybe you think it is moral to do that. All right. Guys, let's finally get to this 3 things challenge here. I was thinking the other day, let's play a game of what 3 things are accomplishable for your area. So let's play a quick game of pretend. And depending on where you live, you may not have to pretend. You may just have to look out your window. But let's say that we are in mid 2024. The elections are coming up. We'll get there eventually. And politically, socially, and economically, this country is on the ropes. even worse than it is today. And things are not great in your area of the state. Gangs have become more common and criminals are overwhelming local law enforcement. Again, depending on where you live, this may not be pretend. And a few members of your community, they know you run the neighborhood watch. They did not want to join previously. Now they are concerned and they come to you and they say, "Oh, we want to join the neighborhood watch." But they're unprepared to contribute because they have no valuable skills. And what I would encourage you to do is put yourself in that situation. Put yourself in the gray zone, right? The gray zone is a space between war and peace. It is not empty. The third world, like parts of Mexico, El Salvador, places like that, where those places are not, you couldn't define that as conventional war. You couldn't define that as state conflict, but there absolutely is a war happening there. Low intensity conflict slash life in the gray zone. Identify the three things that you would want. And I'm not talking about an item. I'm talking about a concept or a group. Identify three things that you would want in that situation. It could be anything. I'm going to list mine out. And I'll tell you what, in the comments, if you want, in the comments, go ahead and post what you think. The three things that you would want in the gray zone situation. The number one thing that I would want by far is I would want my neighborhood watch to have some form of immediate communications. By the way, that is what, time cannot be one of these things. You cannot have more time. You're only delaying the inevitable. But back some years ago, there's like a big sale and there were like 10 of those Baofeng radios. Listen, I think Baofengs work great in a pinch. I don't want to put my life on the line on a Baofeng radio, but for what it is, I don't think it's bad. So I bought 10 of them just to hand out to my community in case something catastrophic happened. I guarantee you my neighbors are not going to have that stuff. So my number one thing is some form of immediate communications. It could be VHF, UHF, like Baofeng radios, which are relatively inexpensive. They're like, what, 30 or 40 bucks, or at least they were the last time I looked. Preferably, though, I would want a mesh network where we can share data like photos and videos. And in the Gray Zone Summit last year, I talked with NC Scout about a mesh network. And we've been playing around with different kinds of antennas and Wi-Fi routers and devices to build a mesh network. And we are now trying to figure out how we can build a bigger mesh bubble in our area. Ideally, that's the number one thing I want, a mesh network to share data. So it's not just like, okay, you click up on a radio and if nobody's listening, that's it, right? You can send text messages, you can have a chat, you can stream video, post pictures or video of things going on around in the community. And now all of a sudden it's like, hey, there's not just a robbery. Now here's some live video. Here's pictures of the robbers. And all of a sudden, it's not just like, here what these two guys look like. Now we got pictures of these guys. And that's something that just a standard radio like a Baofeng is not going to get you. That's why I want a mesh network, because being able to share data in the gray zone, I think, is incredibly important. And then, of course, you've got to have all the various infrastructure to build that up, right? I mean, power goes down, your mesh network goes down. Well, let's work on some power redundancy and things like that. All right. Moving on to, hey, what's up, Joshua? All right, let's move on to number 2. Ideally, after having some form of immediate communications like a mesh network, I want favorable political and social terrain. I want the people who live around me to, generally support me and what we're trying to do regarding trying to bring security to an area. My goal is to identify people who are neutral and turn them into passive supporters at least, or identify people who are passively supporting me, turn them into active supporters. That's having good human terrain around you, turning people into supporting your security mission. And then also, it would be great. I think in this scenario, in some counties, I think the county sheriff will probably just start deputizing a lot of people. If you live rural, if you live in a city, uh, I don't think any. I just don't really see that happening. A lot of people talked about the unrest in South Africa a few years ago about how basically these community members just linked together and kept the rioters out of their neighborhoods. I don't think that is an unrealistic scenario. I really don't, especially if we do get into food shortages. And I'm always reminded, Andrew Yang, back in 2020, warned about the risk that race riots could turn into food riots. And that's not me, that's Andrew Yang talking about that in 2020. And he got his little PB smacked for that too, because he called them race riots. And that's just not something you can do in America. By the way, just briefly, I was just skimming through this whole Jack Del Rio controversy where he allegedly basically was saying, hey, why is everyone making a big deal about J6? And nobody's saying anything about a whole summer of rioting where there were billions of dollars in damages and businesses were burned down and people were murdered. And that's just not something you could say. And I know for the past few years now, at least for the past 2.5 years, the United States has sunken into Soviet level absurdity with regard to political correctness and what you can say publicly and what you can't say publicly. And it seems like every week the United States is just reaching new lows. It's like, you read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, and I couldn't even finish the whole book. It was just bad story after bad story. After a while, I was just like, man, this is just, okay, it was bad. We know it's bad. Well, that's a whole different show, but you wonder how bad things could get in the Soviet Union and how that many people could just kind of go along to get along with the system when the Soviets were, it's like any, prison. The prison guards are vastly outnumbered, but everyone was kind of intimidated into going along to get along. And it got so bad that people were reporting on their parents. And, you read stories about the East German Stasi, and 1 in 4, allegedly, according to Stasi records at least, 1 in 4 residents in East Germany were Stasi informants. And they would go so far as to inform on their neighbors or inform on family members in order to not cast aspersion on themselves, in order to save themselves. They would say, oh, I'm going to go inform on my neighbor. And that way the local commissar or whatever, local authorities will not suspect me of harboring any anti-communist or capitalist bourgeoisie beliefs. And as we know from reading Solzhenitsyn, didn't always work. As a matter of fact, I remember that one story, and this guy was reporting on everybody to save himself, and eventually he got arrested because someone else reported on him. And at first he said, "Oh no, you've got the wrong guy. Trust me, I'm a member of the party. I'm good to go. I support what you're doing. You have the wrong guy." And then they threw him in the gulag. And I don't know what happened to him after that, but they got the wrong guy and they really didn't care. So at any rate, I think he got what he deserved. All right, let's move on to at any rate, back to number 2. I want law enforcement officials or political officials at least to, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I think as long as we are providing security in the spirit of the law, I want local law enforcement to leave me alone. I want to say to him, don't worry about our neighborhood. You don't have to come here. You don't have to do anything. This place is going to be safe. Focus your efforts elsewhere. I'm not saying this will happen. Honestly, I just want my political leaders and law enforcement to say, all right, Mike, you provide security for this little sector of the area. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but we're talking about ideal situations here. In some places, some of you probably will become de facto law enforcement. I just want some leniency here. And then the third thing, if we have already, this is one of the most important reasons to be, especially if you live out in the county somewhere or some rural area, reach out to local homesteaders and small farms, because in this scenario, they are going to need help. They will probably sleep well knowing that a couple of dudes showing up in the next, 5-10 minutes armed is a phone call away. And just for my little prepper fiction novel here, having these cooperative relationships with area ranches and small farms and homesteads is going to allow us to build some kind of cooperation where they provide us with spring water or clean water, beef, milk, honey, and seasonal fruits and vegetables. And they also, this is the biggest one, they also advise others on how to run their own backyard gardens. I was telling Troy, a couple months ago, maybe even back in like January, February, Troy and I sat down, and I said, here's what we know is coming, or here's what we have a firm conviction is coming to the United States. How do you profit off of that? What publicly listed companies are there that you can invest in once the market does hit a floor? And I don't think we're there yet. But once the market does hit a floor, what's going to be in demand? And I thought Tractor Supply and stores like that, Walmart, anything that sells gardening, livestock, grow your own food kinds of stores, anything that sells those products, I think are probably going to do well. And I have not seen any research on this, but I would be interested to see how many Americans have planted their own front or backyard gardens. How many Americans have their own victory gardens? And maybe it just hasn't hit the average American yet, that without fertilizer, yields are going to be plummet, or with less fertilizer, yields are going to plummet. Next year, I think they'll know. But I'm very interested. I would be very interested to see what percentage of Americans actually have their own garden versus a year from now. And I bet you that number a year from now is going to be much, much higher. All right, so those are my three things. My neighborhood watch has a form of immediate communications, preferably a mesh network. Number two, we have elected good political leaders, and we have a county sheriff that we have built some level of trust with, and he allows us to, in the spirit of the law, protect our ranches and homes and farms as we see fit in the spirit of the law, maybe even be deputized. And then number three, we've formed area relationships. We formed relationships with ranches and small farms and homesteaders in the area to build build a network maybe that will not only allow us access to food and the ability to, I'm going to say distribute food, but I don't mean in a socialist sense, but I mean distribute food to buy goodwill and distribute food to buy people's cooperation, so to speak. I won't say buy people's cooperation, to establish goodwill. Give away the excess or can the excess or do whatever we're going to do with the excess. And those are my three things. This is far from a perfect scenario, or far from a perfect setup. These are just kind of initially my three things, kind of going from zero. I mean, obviously, you'll notice I did not mention firearms because, well, for lots of reasons. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that most of my neighbors already have firearms. What I want you to do is identify those three things for yourself and then break those things down into sub-tasks. We want to accomplish, number one, my neighborhood is linked up with communications. Okay, great. That is the overall mission. Break that down into subtasks. Well, I've got to get radios, and I've got to train people on how to use the radios. And I've got to make sure that the radios are operable, that there's some maintenance happening on these radios. They're always charged, for instance, or the antennas are not broken, things like that, or someone didn't accidentally erase channels that we had programmed on the phone, right? Things like that. Break that down into subtasks and then start working towards that goal. I may not need all the houses in my neighborhood to all be linked up today. But if I can start with one, I have just doubled the amount of people I have in this radio network. And then you and that other individual, you go to the next most likely person to join, and there's two of you, and then you get three on board. And the next time you take three people and you go to number 4. And that guy says, well, hell, if there's already 3 of you on here, sure, yeah, I'll be number 4. Okay, great. And then you just keep doing that until you get buy-in, because what you're building here is social proof. Social proof. Well, if Bill and Ted are into this thing, yeah, sure. I mean, it can't be all that bad. So once you've identified your top 3 things, break those into subtasks and chop, start knocking those things down. By the way, I was thinking more about John S., the guy who last week asked me, when will it be time to take back the country, or something like that? When are we going to take back our country? And I don't know what John S.'s situation is. However, this is a popular question, and I would address it thusly. If you can't take back your neighborhood, do not come talking to me about taking back the country. If you cannot get your local dog catcher elected, the guy that you want to be elected, there's no hope for the country. Clean your room, as Jordan Peterson said. Everything starts locally. You want to change the world for better? Start with changing yourself. If you can't change yourself, don't talk to me about improving the world. Your strategic mission remains to carve out a first world zone in a third world country. I think things are going to get much worse this decade. The good news is some people have already strategically located. And if you have, your mission remains the same. Hopefully this is my problem with strategic relocation. People say, oh, I've lived in California for 30 years. I've lived in New York for 40 years. And I'm going to pick up and go buy 5 acres in Montana where I don't know anybody. And in some instances, those people who have strategically relocated for security may actually be digging themselves even deeper holes. Because the place where you lived for 40 years, you should have one hell of a network just from people that you know and trust in an area. And for you to leave all that behind to go to somewhere that's, yeah, sure, it's less populated, but where you know nobody and you've got to start all over. And not only do you not know anybody, but the people who surround you don't know you. And, oh, by the way, you're from California, or, oh, you're from New York. All right, you're kind of suspect anyway. I saw this Texas license plate the other day, and it said BYECAL, BYECAL, a Texas license plate. And I saw that, and I thought, oh, you think that's going to save you? Not literally. But people from California, New York, I think deserve some scrutiny, especially when they're moving to states like Florida and Texas and Montana and Idaho and all the rest of them. So your strategic mission remains, you got to carve out a first world zone. I say carve out, you really got to build this, house by house, block by block, city council seat by city council seat, or county commission seat by county commission seat. Build yourself a first world zone in a third world country. We can expand later. It starts there. Don't talk about taking back the country. You cannot take back your town. I'm talking politically and socially and culturally. So identify those 3 things. All right. With that, maybe we'll take a couple questions. If there are any good questions. How do you go about floating the idea to a local rancher if I can afford to feed some feeder cattle? Well, depending on where you live and depending on how long this guy's driveway is, you might just, if you see him in the driveway or see him out in the field, you might just walk over to the fence and wave. If he's not like chasing calves or something, how about this? If you see somebody fixing a fence, repairing a fence, go and help them. Back when I used to read Joel Salatin books a lot, right? I've read most of his books. One of the things he recommended was to get a start is don't go buy to get started on your own local homestead. Don't go buy a bred heifer, even though that's or a couple of bred heifers, even though that's a super popular way to get started. He said, go offer to work on someone's ranch and to say, hey, I want to work for you because I want a calf or I want one of your heifers, and I will provide you free labor if you provide me some pointers. And after I've worked so long, whatever that bred heifer is worth, a bred heifer is just a first year female cow that has a little baby calf inside. And after I have worked so many hours or so much time, then I want a bred heifer from you, but I want to learn in the process. And I actually think that's a really good way to get started. But I would just approach them and Dustin, can you bring that question back on the screen again? Please. I would just approach them and say, "Hey, I've heard that uh, check local auction prices. If they're way down, you have a much higher likelihood of this working. But go over to the guy and just ask him. I say, hey, I got a couple questions about the beef industry. If you'd be willing to talk to me for a couple minutes and just inquire, and you might even just ask if he has some. Just say, hey, I've been thinking about buying buying a calf, or say, hey, can I pay to feed some of your calves if they can stay on your property for a while, and at the end of the year, you can take them to butcher. I don't know, just get to know the guy and talk to him. And I mean, I'd be fairly direct, especially if you live in an area where a lot of ranches, because even if that guy says no, you just turn around and go to the next ranch, one property over. All right. It may be a numbers game. Sorry, Dustin, what's the next question? If there is one, how large of a problem is population density if most aren't prepared? I think it's a really big problem. As a matter of fact, that is one of the questions. That's one of the questions I used to ask when I was teaching people how to do area studies, like in these classes. And, even today, like I'll go to prepper camp. And by the way, I think I'm going to be back at prepper camp. I think this September, if the wheels don't fall apart or fall off the train until then. But, all these super preppers talking about how super prepared they are, and they're king prepper. And I would ask, what's the population density? How many people live within a quarter mile of you? And they don't know. And I just ask, how king prepper can you be if you don't know something basic like that? If you haven't calculated that into your area study, or calculated that into the local threats. I don't know what your situation is, but in terms of population density, if I live in an area that cannot sustain itself, I'd be concerned. I would be very concerned, because it's not just fertilizer and food. It's also gas. It's diesel and gas, and it's the entire oil industry, as a matter of fact. So, and it's also unemployment. If Fed Chair Powell does hike us right into a recession, and it's deep, which it might be, because if that's what he has to do to combat inflation, I think that's probably what he's going to do. And then once inflation comes down, they can start printing money slowly and providing more targeted stimulus to try to get the economy back up. If that happens, and again, that's kind of assuming that A, they can get around inflation, and B, they don't create another round of inflation when they start to print money. So if we do have a deep recession, unemployment, how are these people going to eat? Food is not as cheap as it used to be, and these people are unemployed. I just look at these places, and there could be some very large problems encountered on a day-to-day basis in these areas. All right, we'll do one more question here. Is a big Berkey water filtration system and a backyard retention pond a sufficient water prep? Well, it depends on your operational requirements. How many people do you have to provide water to? I have a big Berkey water filter. It's still in the box just because I haven't used it or set it up yet. We also have 2 ponds. So, I would start with, how many people do you have to provide water to? And I would say, consider that you might have family, and not you specifically, but in some cases you might have family that comes to live with you if you have sufficient means. And what do they say? Like a gallon of water per person per day. So start from there. You know, how many gallons of water in a retention pond does that hold? Uh, how many gallons of water could you conceivably get out of that pond? And, you know, if it's a drought, I don't know, cut that in half, maybe. I don't know. So I don't know the math on this. That's something that you should ask Super Prepper. But that's kind of what that's kind of what my starting point would be. It's 1 gallon of water per person per day times how many people I have, and then start looking for. By the way, I think a big Berkey water filter is probably one of the best ones you can buy. Yeah, I see a couple people say like more like 3 to 5 gallons a day. Yeah, listen, man, in Texas in July, yeah, it's probably gonna be more than 1 gallon per day. If the power's off and you have no AC, yeah, you probably are looking, and you're active, you're in the fields, or you're, you know, doing whatever in the garden, and it's hot outside. Yeah, you probably are looking at more than 1 gallon per day. But I just heard Super Prepper say that's kind of the baseline. Also depends, you know, how large you are. All right, guys, with that, I think we're going to call it a show. I'll be back tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central Time. I think we're going to jump into one of these books that I'm reading because I got some more notes that is important to understand regarding how to win low intensity conflict, which is a topic on this show. With that, everyone, thanks for watching. Again, patreon.com/outfront at 100 Patreon supporters. We're so close. I'll give away a free area intelligence course, Gray Zone study, Gray Zone study group, or Gray Zone book club account, or a free Forward Observer early warning account annual. All right. With that, everyone, thanks for being here. Until tomorrow, 2 p.m. Be well and stay out front.